Welcome to Wivelsfield Church. You are now standing on this metalled lane on part of what is known as the Long Ridge, an ancient trackway which from primeval times led through the district. At the far end of this lane, in that direction, you're not far from Lunces, probably the most ancient and probably the biggest of the early estates in this area. And it was almost certainly the Lord of Lunces that built the first church here. We believe it may well have been Wivell himself, for this is Wivelsfield. Those of you who know the county of Somerset will recognise the name Wiveliscombe. Well, that was Wivell's Combe, probably not the same Wivell, but Wivell was a Saxon first name. So we're in a very ancient place, this being Wivelsfield, Wivell Lord of Lunces, and many ancient churches were built close to their lord's estates. Now let us move through the gate into the churchyard itself. So we're in the churchyard. Now let your eye follow the brick path towards the church. Notice on the right hand side the ancient yew tree. It is far older than any part of the building, well over 1,000 years old, and has stood witness through the centuries to the faithful coming to this place of prayer. Imagine in your mind's eye the people who century after century have walked this way, in good times and in bad, in times of joy, times of sorrow, in times of fear when there was plague, in times of war, thanksgiving for peace. The Saxon warrior, the Norman soldier, Tudor merchant, 18th century farmer, Victorian lady. All through the 1,000 years of this building have been coming to this place for any kind of purpose, to celebrate, or as I say, to commiserate. Now if you look towards the building itself, you come to our most notable feature, the north door, which is the Saxon door, built around 1040, around the time of the conquest, just before the conquest. And we're pretty sure now that it is a twin to the one in Bolney, probably made by the same stonemason, the same craftsman. It no longer stands where it once stood because the Victorians added the aisle that you can see in front of you in the middle of the 1860s. Mercifully, they saved the Saxon Doorway, and when they built the new aisle, they reconstructed it a little further north as part of that new aisle, so it's preserved. Clearly the stone for that north wall was quarried locally, we believe in Skeins Hill, and it looks like a Victorian wall. But obviously the Victorians would not have just thrown away all the Saxon stone, they would have thrown away the crumbling and rotten stone. But there must, I think, in common sense, be quite a lot of the stone from the Saxon period encased within that wall. Now, if you look to the left, you will see a projection coming towards you from the main wall of the church, and that is the church extension, which was finished in 1992, so very modern. And you will see it's a wonderful match for the rest of the church building. The stone there was provided by an old quarry on, I think that was Skeins Hill. The corner dressing stone is in Cobb Crag, which came from Northumberland. So that's the building. When we think about all these people coming over the centuries to the church, you will notice that in some of the times, certainly in Elizabeth's time, Queen Elizabeth I, they were compelled to come by law. And if they did not come, as one Ninian Burrell, that's a name that is known locally from the Burrell estate out on the A24, the Burrell roundabout in Haywardsheath. It's a family, whether it's the same family or not I'm not sure, but the name is certainly still local. Ninian Burrell in 1608, he was summoned to the Archdeacon's court for rarely frequenting the church. Now, this area to the north of the church is the oldest part of the churchyard and contains 54 marked graves. It's apparent that the level of the soil has been raised, and some argue this was a common practice in olden times to provide land for more burials. So the level of the land has been raised, and indeed the Saxon door doesn't look terribly Saxon from this angle because it looks short, but the church is set lower, and if you go round into the building you will see its true proportions, which makes it tall and thin. To the left of the gate is the memorial, and to my left as well, the memorial for those lost from the village in the 2 World Wars. A very large number from the First World War and a smaller number for the Second World War. And there is a matching memorial within the church itself. When they prepared to build that extension on the left, when they dug it out, they found 4 lead coffins. These coffins were reinterred in the south yard. The graves hereabout are mainly in family groupings, the largest being the Geoffrey family, who lie in plots between the 2 yew trees. All of these date to the first half of the 19th century. Other graves are earlier. The altar or slab tombs, you can see one there. There's one for Thomas Jenner, who was a one-time church warden, and is dated 1681. But the others are indecipherable. The earliest burial record we have in the registers is that of Mr. Thomas Nudigat, 16th of October 1559. Now let us proceed to the western wall. We are now standing in front of the west wall. The church as a whole was principally built of sandstone, rubble and ashlar, and some believe that the stone was quarried originally from an ancient quarry that stood on Lunce's Common. This wall is 14th century. To the right of the doorway, that is to my left, by the buttress, just beyond the buttress, there was once a flight of steps which went to a west gallery, which was built in to provide for musicians before the days of organs. That doorway, steps and a doorway at the top to let them in, those disappeared with the Victorian extensions and improvements, and the west gallery was removed from the inside of the church, and it is now very difficult to discern where that doorway was in the stonework or where the stairway was, but it was to the far side of the buttress. A more modern addition to the stonework, if you look carefully at the lower part of this buttress to my left, you will see an arrow carved into the stone. It's actually an Ordnance Survey mark, and we are on a ridge here. So take note of that, and then we will go round the corner and talk about the tower. We are now by the tower, built in around 1500. Notice the more Tudor looking style of window with a squared top, and also if you look carefully at the decoration on the top of the window, you will see on each side strange beasts. One an owl, and the other, difficult to see, but it's a musician, possibly playing a flute. And we believe that the medieval craftsmen were probably copying earlier Celtic legends and things, with the owl for wisdom and the other figure, the musician, either for music or for the joy of music. Difficult to discern the musician, but you can clearly see the owl. All right, Leon, let us go a little further to my right and we'll talk about the porch. We are now looking at the porch to the south door of the church. It's on the south side. It is actually a quite unremarkable Victorian porch, which was quite poorly constructed. You'll notice if you go round behind me and look where it joins the church, that the roof isn't chased into the main roof of the south aisle, but simply abutted with a straight back, and therefore quite often leaks in heavy weather. Very poorly done. However, there would always have been a porch here. It's a replacement porch, because porches were important in early times, and many of the kind of quasi-judicial processes that the church wardens would have conducted, little court sessions and the collecting of dues and tithes, would take place within the porch. They were quite important things. For us, we just think it's a way to shake your Macintosh out and shake the drips off your hat. But to them, it was an important place. And so they replaced it when the medieval one was no longer possible to retain. Let's move across to my left, where we're going to look at the medieval chapel and some interesting features. We are now close to the medieval chantry chapel, which is to my right, built in around 1200. We'll talk about that more in detail inside the building. However, this is quite an ancient feature of the church, and there's one oddity about it which is built into the corner of the church. To my right, you will see a small feature with a hole. What is that feature, and why am I mentioning it? It is in fact what is known as a mass dial. This would have been a carved piece of stone in a form of a sundial with divisions, a hole in the centre, and when you wanted to read the time, you pick up a stick or a twig and you put it in the hole as a gnomon. So it would act as a gnomon and it would cast a shadow, and from that you could tell the time and how long it would be till the next mass. So, I hear you cry, what is wrong with this mass dial? It is not facing south. It is in the wrong position, and moreover it is upside down. So how did it get here? If this is 1200, it's a very, very early mistake. But no one will move it now because that is part of its interesting history. Now let's talk about the churchyard itself. Oh, glass is upside down, not very good. We're now standing in the south yard, the south part of the churchyard, and it is here that all manner of activities would have taken place over the centuries. Social gatherings, open air plays, village festivals, fairs, church ales. Those were sort of church bazaars where they brewed small beers, it was called, and to earn money for the church through the sale of it. And today those practices have been resurrected, if you will, for recently we've had similar things here with stalls in the churchyard, in the unused part of the churchyard at the bottom, with marquees and stalls and crafts for things like flower festivals and other things, harvest and so on. If the weather is fine, we've held activities in the churchyard, which ties us in with our forebears from centuries past. As you will note, the churchyard today is very carefully tended and it is kept in a very good condition. And you won't be able to see very clearly, but the whole of the churchyard wall has recently been repointed with lime mortar in the ancient manner. So a lot has been spent and a lot of care has been lavished on the churchyard to keep it in good condition. However, in 1609, Richard Dumbrell, then church warden, reported, "Our churchyard is in default, but who is to repay it we cannot tell." So we are doing rather better. A painting dated from 1847 shows the pathway down through the centre of the churchyard to a gap in a perimeter fence. There was no wall originally, and at a certain time a wooden post and rail fence surrounded the churchyard. But there was a gap, and there still is a gap, where today you have a little wrought iron gate. Same path, same route. And originally, the route across the fields to the south door of the church for people in the northern parts of both Kemah and Ditchling parishes, on this side of the common if you will, found it easier to come here than to their own parish churches very often. And in 1789, John Burgess, Baptist diarist, recorded, "Went to Wivelsfield Church." So it wasn't just the Anglicans that found it convenient to come here, even if they belonged to another parish, but people from other denominations used this church as well. The headstones and grave markings are quite interesting. There are two, I'm going to point behind me, against that western wall, there are two cast iron headboards now against the wall to commemorate John Fuller of Ditchling, died 1845, and his wife Anne, who predeceased him in 1807. We have buried here Bishop Henry Montgomery Campbell, once vicar here, but later to gain fame as Bishop of London. But Bishop of London will know he chose this little spot to be buried. We also have Kenneth Milne, the brother of A.A. Milne, buried here. So surely Christopher Robin would have come to visit his uncle in Wivelsfield. We also have John Saxby. Behind me, by the corner of the path, is the tall cross and the grave of John Saxby, the inventor of the interlocking railway signal, a great advance in railway technology. The wife of Ralph Richardson, the famous actor, lies buried here, as does the brother of Bob Monkhouse. We thought we might have got a good donation from Bob's appearance at the funeral, but we did not. They all found their last resting place here, as did the 4 children of Thomas and Eliza Bartlett. All 4 children died within 1 week in 1898. This was a result of diphtheria caused by an infected well in the old school that lies on the other side of the lane just a few yards along. A great tragedy for the village. The churchyard, we also have, of course, our most famous dead residents are, I haven't mentioned, they are Richard Miles and his wife Dorothy, both murdered in the Royal Oak pub, which once stood on the corner at Jacob's Post, on the edge of Ditchling Common. In 1734, when the Jacob the Pedlar, as that he's known, and therefore Jacob's Post, had a donkey cart and was trading his way up across the common, it is said he went in, took the takings, murdered the couple and their maid, and then escaped north. Later, of course, he was apprehended, tried and hanged in Horsham, and his body was then brought back to Wivelsfield, hung in a gibbet cage on a post on the corner of the main road, and there it rotted. And until that pub was demolished only about 18 months ago, part of that gibbet post was still retained behind the bar. So that's our most famous incident to do with the churchyard, really. The churchyard, as we have it here, is obviously quite large. It was extended twice to the south in 1893 and again in 1928. And you can see the feature that crosses the churchyard, the cross path. At that point you will note that the wall drops in height, and that marks the start of one of the extensions. The Godman Irvins of Great Oat Hall, the landowners around us, were generous in giving the land for these extensions to the churchyard, and the current landowner, Carola Godman Irvin, remains generous towards the church and will host our fete this coming year.